So, thank you for being here with us today. It's a big pleasure for me to try to spark a dialogue on this relevant, interesting, and a little bit painful topic. And I wouldn't really like to take much time from the discussion, since I'm convinced that all of you are impatient as much as I am to hear our discussant. Here today with us are Professor Stavros Stavrides from School of Architecture from National Technical University in Athens, Professor Mina Petrovic from Department of Sociology, Faculty of Philosophy, University of Belgrade, Iva Čukić and Jovana Timotijević from Institute for Spatial Policy, or Ministry of Space, as we all know it, and Danilo Ćurčić from A11 Initiative for Economical and Social Rights. That will also be the order of presentations, so let's not waste any more time.
Okay. And I have to know how to use this. Okay.
It should work now. Yeah.
Got it. I think less light would be better. It's okay, but it's okay. Just in order to be able to see it. And it's a bit, I don't know why. Well, the pictures look a bit longer than usual, but you can perhaps correct it yourselves. I'm very glad that I'm here. I'm very happy to be invited by the Institute to present in this very friendly and really creative atmosphere. And I'm just considering my contribution more or less like an opening to a dialogue than a strict academic presentation of research or of relevant thoughts. I have to tell you from the beginning that this is an evolving, let's say, research connected to also to education, to the way that my classes on design are being organized in the School of Architecture, concerning social housing design especially. And so it is like a process which is being fueled by design interests, but also returns back to the criteria which should be developed for design, which are of course socially meaningful, and thus we have to attribute to them specific social values, specific social choices. So the question is, can we really learn something by defining housing as a form of urban commons? Can we really understand differently the process of housing and the ways housing was really developed in different periods? And how do we connect this discussion with the discussion that you are, I'm sure that you are familiar with, the discussion about urban commons? I would like, first of all, to explain myself, because it seems that there is a kind of trendy period about commons, like as if every academic presentation has to refer to the commons at least, and thus I have to explain myself. I'm not really interested in commons the way lots of other people are, just putting a wine we already know in a new bottle. I think that we are opening a certain field of knowledge and research if we discuss the problem of the commons as quite distinct from the problem of the community or the communal, and also from the public. Obviously, the commons has real very specific difference from the private, and this is easy to explain and to understand. But should we really understand it also as different from the public or the communal? bear with me, I think we could perhaps discover it together. So, one other small note. It helps to watch the slides, but sometimes the meaning of the slides is only to kind of condense what I'm trying to say. So even if you ignore them, I hope that you could follow what I'm developing as an argument. So there are at least 3 ways in which we can really discuss the problem of housing as connected to the issue of commons. First of all, we can connect it to the problem of social relations and the way social relations are being developed in a housing project, in a housing estate, in a housing complex. And of course, certain social relations have to do with the formation of a community of people who share things. Therefore, even if we will not have to actually suppose that this community is stable or pre-exists the conditions of the housing estate, there might be a process through which cohabitation will develop practices of sharing. Another level, of course, that we have to discuss the problem of the commons has to do with the construction, the way this housing estate, this housing area, this housing complex has been developed. And as we will see in certain examples from Latin America, this is really crucial. The way people participate in the construction of their future houses already develops an attitude towards commoning, towards sharing between equals. And last but not least, of course, there is an issue that has to do with property. Are we talking about practices of commoning in housing complexes that really touch the problem of property? Are we talking about common property, and what are the ways that we understand common property? As we will see, it's not obvious. So I will somehow connect and compare, if you want, 2 periods. I'm not going to follow a history of housing, obviously, but I think in 2 crucial periods, the problem of housing as commons has emerged, although in the first period it was not really stated like that. It was not even conceived as a specific problem that has to do with commons as distinct from public. But I think a comparison between those 2 periods can possibly produce relevant criteria for us to judge the possibilities, the potentialities of sharing through housing and through being in a process of cohabitation. So the first period is the 20s and 30s, and I'm referring to actual experiments in that period in which visionary architects, and of course connected to specific municipalities, were actually trying to develop forms of cohabitation that were supposedly hinting, gesturing towards a future society. Of course, all of you know the cases of the Weimar Republic experiments, and also the Red Vienna and the USSR first period experiments that were really trying to conceive new forms of social relations, especially supported, encouraged, really sometimes forced to be in existence by the design of housing areas and parts of cities. I would say from the beginning that I am really very skeptical if this actually produced common spaces. That is, spaces which were shared, and in sharing I include practices in which people actually develop the rules and the forms of sharing. These were mostly experiments, very, very interesting, but mostly experiments that tried, if you want to use this expression, from above, from a certain state form, local or government state, to produce conditions in hope of creating practices that we today call commoning practices. Let us remember, first of all, this experiment, the project of the house commune already included an effort to devise a new element from which the city would be constituted. This autonomous community, this Dom Comuna, I don't know if I'm saying it well, was really meant to become a social condenser. Therefore, a place in which real social relations progressing towards a collective spirit would become possible because of an arrangement of houses, an arrangement of cohabitation environment in which people will actually discover the potentialities of those relations. So the idea of the social condenser, and you know, of course, the kind of criticisms that this project faced at the later period of Stalinist architecture. Then we have the idea of the Neues Frankfurt, the idea of creating a fragment of a future city. Ernst May's Frankfurt was actually developed in hope of creating a model city in those suburban areas through which the actual existing historical city would be forced to evolve to a more collectively organized and based on sharing model. Again, we know, of course, that this was not really the case. We had some interesting experiments, including, of course, the Frankfurt kitchen. And what is really distinct in the case of Berlin in that period, the Weimar period, is the fact that those areas were really part of the city. They were not suburban areas. So there was an effort to kind of introduce the virus, a kind of virus in the actually existing city in order to make it transform to a more collectively managed cohabitation environment. And last but not least, of course, it's the Red Vienna experiments in which a whole culture of the working classes was to be monumentalized in cohabitation practices. So we have an additional element, if you want, in the direction of producing cases of sharing through housing and developing new forms of social relations. This additional element was the expressivity of these areas. You can see marked the places in which those people had to fight against Nazi attacks during that period. So they were a kind of working class strongholds. And let us then pass to another period, and let us try to compare it to the period of the 20s and 30s, in which you had this kind of experiments based on the idea that new social relations will be necessarily produced through the arrangement of a new cohabitation environment. These areas, this period is contemporary, it's today's period. And my examples will then come not from Europe, but from Latin America, because I think there you have an interesting developing ethos of sharing, that it is not declared as a policy, it is not declared by establishing forms that are being developed and managed by a certain authority, but it's really practiced from below by the actual presence and the forces of homeless movements of homeless people or homeless workers, if you want. And interestingly, and I borrow here from James Holston, interestingly, this is a form of not really trying to project to a future city with the values of sharing, but actually demanding to become part of the existing city, thus, as Holston suggests, thus actually trying to establish the right to the city, a kind of citizenship based on these demands and also on the practices which actually make those demands partially form part of the reality. This kind of insurgent citizenship, as Holston calls it, is really a politicization of the oikos. Oikos is in Greek house, actually it's household. Therefore, there is a process in which this kind of demand for house by the people who are not allowed or who cannot have access to decent housing is actually shaping new forms of demand that have to do with practices of social organization, forms of social organization based on sharing, as we will see. The first example, I will give you three cases, three examples, and maybe they can help in this comparison. The first case is the case of the Uruguayan Federation of Housing Associations through self-help. The ayuda mutua is the term in Spanish. The interesting thing is in those associations, which are very much connected to labor unions, and they played a crucial role during the dictatorship in Uruguay as the only remaining area of resistance, is that they are based at least in three traditions that are really existing in Latin America. One is the tradition of self-management, not as an ideology, not as a political project, but as part of the everydayness of people who are in need. So the everyday collaboration and the cooperativist tradition are actually a very important substratum, a very important fuel of these associations. And then the practices of ayuda mutua, which means mutual help, which means an exchange in support stemming from rural areas in which this exchange is necessary for people to be able to cope with the problems of cultivation. And this, of course, also is a tradition that is very well grounded not only in rural populations but also in urban populations. And last but not least, a crucial element in FUCVAM, in this federation, is the fact that they developed a form of demand that actually managed to produce a new legal situation obviously in a capitalist country, which is encouraging or at least allowing collective ownership of houses. These are some images of those FUCVAM construction sites. As you can see, there are processes in which voting and assemblies are essential. So the practice of commoning is not after the buildings are built, and the process is not based on the idea of arranging forms of cohabitation based on sharing, but also the process of construction is essential in making people aware of their power to actually participate in taking decisions collectively. And here's the inauguration of one of those buildings. Just an emblematic image, the way that people can actually appropriate what can, in other terms, be described as public space, because it's their own public space. And please keep this in mind, to understand public space not simply as belonging to a nameless or anonymous authority that somehow supervises the rules of its use, but actually understand publicness or public space as something which is shared between people who actually use it, is a step towards commoning. Thus, we have those images. This is one of the buildings which is created for women who are really organizing themselves, especially women with the children and no husbands. So it's one of the indications that this is not simply a movement that has to do with satisfying the needs of housing, but it opens problems that have to do with cultural demands. Is this specific building. My second example comes from Brazil. Here you have the homeless movements, which are not really fighting only for the right to housing, which is essential. It is, as you have seen with Holston's argument, it's essential for demanding to be part of the society, especially for the people in the peripheries. And those people are actually trying to organize not only to become future inhabitants, to ask from the state the right to have social housing to live in, but also are being educated through the participation in the construction. And it's interesting to see that those people are actually starting from occupying the land, demanding from the state some kind of support for the construction of the future houses. Already in this process, they develop forms of collaboration and collective life, like communitary kitchen. But then, and this is a case that I just briefly show you, but then from this self-built housing arrangement, which is more or less a favela, people organize and manage to be part of the construction of this kind of housing estates. These are self-managed housing estates, although they were built by federation money, the money from the federal government. And also an important tradition in Brazil is the role of the technical assistants, as they call them, because they really develop forms of participatory planning in which architects are not outside experts who simply help people to actually produce what they want to produce in order to house themselves, but they are collaborators, co-present in the process of participation, and thus help in the creation of different forms of housing. These are images from Usina, one of those technical assistants. And my last example, so I will not pass my time, comes from Mexico, in which never mind about these parts of an interview, but just to see what kinds of words this person uses to describe their process. They are aware that they are not simply fighting for housing, they are fighting for a different form of social organization, to create their own history. These are his words, or to actually construct their own process of autonomy. And one more important thing, if you want, an additional element in the process of realizing the power of commoning, is the fact that they are actually creating a shared culture, as they say, because they realize and they know that they come from different urban traditions and different cultures. So these are pictures of one of those autonomous neighborhoods, as they call themselves. It's important the fact that they use the word autonomy, urban autonomy, and by that they don't mean secluded enclaves of otherness. They mean forms through which a new way of self-management develops, distinct from state, distinct from the market, distinct from the forces that tend to shape housing in the capitalist country they live in. They have, of course, an urban garden, collective spaces like the Plaza de los Filósofos. They chose to name one of their main squares the Square of the Philosophers. And they have their own radio station, recognizable things. And also another case, an autonomous neighborhood in Mexico, also in Mexico City, in which you just observe the plan and see the names of the streets. It's a kind of declaration of values like land, dignity, education, and so on and so forth. My last point, I think this proves, if you compare it with examples of the 20s and the 30s, that we are talking about practices in which a kind of form of social organization is being developed along the process of demanding and constructing housing. It does not come from an outside arrangement. It does not come from a decision taken for the people. It's being a decision that's being developed through the practices of really participation, and thus the problem of power, of course, is being raised. So in these processes, the problem of power is being defined as a process in which the sharing of power seems to be the most important part in the sharing process. To share space, to share facilities, to share resources, you need to have forms of management of those practices. You need to develop rules which, if they are not based on the sharing of power, will limit themselves, or they will end up in producing new enclosures and new forms of distinction between people. And this, I think, is a possible lesson from these examples in Latin America. I think the potentialities of urban commoning through housing are not really restricted, defined in the processes that produce the buildings or give form to the struggles, but are also producing forms of social organization that are being tested in practice by real people in real life. Thank you very much.
Continue a little bit more about domestic context.
It's not about the domestic. Should I take?
I think
is it? Yeah. Okay. Is it working? Okay. Yeah. Well, this is like a bad pupil dropping the pencil. Yeah. When I asked Sarah what she expects me to tell about, she told me, keep your academic level, it will be okay. So I am comforted within my academic level, and I'm afraid I'm not having actually the empirical examples that much, but I would stress maybe some points that Stavros already pointed, meaning that really public is not the same as the common. And also that the practice of commoning, should I say, is specific for certain historical periods. For instance, that during the so-called welfare state, or where the state actually played its role in providing the housing as much as it could or wanted. At that time, the experience of commons were less visible, let's say, at least in context of more developed world. I have some questions for you about type of ownership and commons, and relations of commons with institutional other institutions, and also about the specifics of Latin American experience and European, for instance, context. Is it comparable, etc.? But we will keep that for discussion. So it's like this. So this, my first slide actually wants to remind us all that housing is a very complex social phenomena, and that inevitably it actually fuses the private and public, and the individual and collective. As having fulfillment the basic human needs, it is always group and individual, or collective and individual, and also having this broader sense of housing, meaning that housing is not only the flat but its surrounding. The issues of social inclusion and cohesion is actually very important. Particular socialization of the children, but not only of the children, of all of us. Different functions are going on within the housing or residential areas, so it is a kind of mingling between public and private spheres, and that's why, for instance, you designers and architects and urban planners actually recognize the category of territorial gradients in planning, actually, the residential area having to somehow gradient to scale private and public. So as sociologists, we are always thinking about this phenomena, housing or residential areas, like a neighborhood, like the dynamic and open field for socio-spatial interactions, which actually is in constant negotiation of posing the boundaries and developing solidarities. Of course, none of this could be visible that easily, or maybe solidarities does not exist at all in some neighborhoods, but that is something that we are thinking about when speaking about neighborhoods. This is what I think is important to have in mind, posing the questions where the commons are actually getting importance. So housing policy emerged with a welfare state, and it's like historic institutional construction based on this kind of social contract between state and citizens in order to redistribute the key social risks that were specific for a certain period. This is the fast industrialization and urbanization of modern societies. Of course, we are speaking mainly of the experience of the developed world. So we have in sociology, in urban sociology in particular, we distinguish two approaches that helps us to understand the social implications of this connection between housing policy, welfare state, and housing. The first one is neo-Marxist approach, which actually providing the role of the state in housing interpreted as housing is a collective consumption, it's a kind of a collective consumption, and we have this Kastel's work of urban question, where he saw the city as actually arena of struggles around public goods and collective consumption, and the housing was one of that. And we have another approach, now the Weberian approach, that was more focused on different type of institutional answers, how to solve the issues of this key social risks at that time. So we, for instance, in Europe or in a developed world, we have a differentiation of welfare states and housing policies within it, like residual, cooperative, and socio-democratic, and also on the other side was the socialist housing policy type and welfare state. They were different according to the role of the state intervention and according to their relations towards the type of property. So was it the private property, primarily regulated? Was it the cooperative or public housing? We can actually underline these attitudes towards cooperative and public housing. For instance, the residual type was very cautious about public housing. It was meant only for the very deprived, while in a cooperative or socio-democratic system you had a very wide conception of the public housing meant for the middle class, etc. And for instance, cooperative housing, which is very often now the theme of the commoning, like it somehow it bridges the gap between the market and the state, between renting and owning, because you have a mixing of this kind of tenures in the cooperatives. And for instance, the socio-democratic welfare states were more keen to this kind of housing. And now we have a post-welfare state period, and what happened with housing. So we are now living in a post-industrial globalized world, and we have changed social or risks for capital. And in this context, actually, the role of the state in housing changed, and the role of market increased. So maybe the most influential approach to understanding this kind of changing is new political economy, which developed the regulation theory, showing that actually the regulation shift the scales at which the regulation of the market, of the society, etc., shift the scales at which the focus is. For instance, during the welfare state period, we have state-centric configuration of the global capitalism. So the state was very important in regulating actually economy, of course, the other spheres of societies. In post-welfare state, reconfiguration of regulation power was perceived at various scales. So the increasing importance of European Union towards national states, or World Bank and other global institutions. And in that context, we have actually important shift in functioning of the state and functioning of the cities from managerial or the redistributive role of the state and the city to entrepreneurial city or state, which so its main actually role was to compete for the capital and not in that much to regulate the inequalities within the national territories of societies. So we have this shift from providing to regulate state in housing. It's instead of the provision, its main role began to define legal and financial frame in order to all the actors in the housing system function smoothly. It was accompanied with reducing the role of public sector. In most of the countries, the privatization of the previously public sector took place. Then we have increasing role of the private sector, not only in new construction, but also in all segments of the housing system, meaning maintenance, etc. So the responsibility of the users and of the private sector. And it was followed actually from objective to subjective subsidies, meaning from those subsidies that were focused on construction to those on buying the flat. So that's its finalization of financialization. I can't pronounce that. So the financial mechanisms in a housing sector actually got importance. And of course, in the developed countries, in rich countries, it was accompanied with this shift from needs, from solving housing shortages to aspirations, to symbolic capital in housing. Of course, individual housing strategies in different kinds of previously mentioned types of housing policy developed according to the available possibilities. In Denmark, for instance, we still have a large segment of the cooperative housing. In some post-socialist countries as well, for instance, Poland made significant efforts to develop cooperative housing, Czech more or less. In Sweden we have preserved a significant amount of qualitative public sector, etc. So there are differences, and individual housing strategies actually develop according to these possibilities. For instance, for the socialist or post-socialist countries, it is very interesting to follow the attitude of the persons towards the private property in housing. So during socialism, even the privileged groups didn't want to own the housing because it was like not the privileged option of the housing system. So everyone who got a good position in the housing actually expected to get a housing from the public sector. But afterwards, with the privatization, so all of us who use the flats in a state or social property wanted to buy the flat, because other housing policy options actually didn't support the public sector. So our actually choices are created by housing policy options. And now I'm asking when the discourse of commons related to housing actually emerged, when and why. So as far as I could review the literature, it emerged maybe in last decade or 2 decades, during the last 2 decades. So we can say that this actually emerged with the rise of neoliberalization of our societies. There are two streams, so to say. One is emphasizing, I'm sorry for the mistakes, emphasis on potentials. So this brings some potentials. And it goes with the affirmations, or again affirmations of the Lefebvre's concept on right to the city, on spaces of representation, spatial practices, lived space, etc. So it understands the city and its citizens as a collective resource, as a right to use the city, so not evaluating everything from this exchange value. So you have here 2 citations of Lefebvre and Harvey, who actually speak about this right of the city and this actually perceiving the urban or the city as a use value, as a collective resource. The other is about emphasis on limitations. So it is actually putting the idea of commons in the context of neoliberalization, of the concept of the minimal state of neoliberal state, which is strong enough, minimal state, to support investors, but weak to deal with consequences of economic restructuring. So, as Margaret Mayer is emphasizing several decades, she is very critical about new urban governance. She is relying on this kind of regulation theory and actually wants to stress that the key is entrepreneurial spirit of the governance, and we have a kind of a niche of urban commons which might be emerging from below, but actually is supported also from above, as it is convenient for the new type of governments. So it somehow stresses that citizens should be entrepreneurial, that and that is in favor of reducing social expenses. So if we are active enough to create our neighborhoods better, if we self-help, if we rely on self-help strategies, then we actually take over some of the functions that previously was on the public sector and responsibility that was on state. So to supplement the managerial role of the state, and we saw that managerial was characteristic of the previous period. So here I relied on Harry's neoliberal state definition, and this in red is maybe most important for our discussion here. So this delegation of public services provision to private and civil sector, that is something that that is the characteristics of the new conception of the state, and reaffirmation of individual entrepreneurial endeavors and social capital also as a key resources for social inclusion through, and it is important, previously neglected participative democracy and self-help strategies. So it was something that was marginalized during the period of welfare state. So here I, as I promised in my abstract, wanted to maybe read some of the experience in socialist, post-socialist Belgrade according to the role of the state and the public sector and maybe urban planning. So I actually want to comment on two cases. One is the illegal construction that emerged during socialism, but also was and is widespread nowadays, and particularly in the 90s. So we can see it as a two-sided process. One side is about those who are actually actors of illegal construction from necessity. So they perform some kind of exit strategies according to the official state or market housing provision, because they are actually cannot be part of it. So is it a tolerated guerrilla urbanism? Because actually a state is very tolerant against it, and in my view it's a kind of, particularly during socialism, it was a kind of hidden social policy. So state couldn't provide flats for all, as it was ideologically promised, and we have here a typical supplementary role coming from above, and somehow fulfilling the right to housing, although the right to housing was never defined during socialism, nor it is today here. And on the other side, we have those who exit planning standards during post-socialism as they can, because they want to occupy exclusive residential locations or violate the inherited standards, and afterwards they actually can legalize their property because they are influential enough to press those who bring them. So is it a kind of, or it is a kind of tolerated investor urbanism? But here we have a kind of emerging clubbing in use of a public space. It could be totally monitoring or totally privatized, or just with restriction use of the space, even through the local standards of decision making. So by their number at a certain neighborhood, they actually get some privileges to protect it from outsiders. Here I wanted to reflect to the Kip's thinking about urban commons, which actually pointed in reflecting about the phenomena, about this dialectic between enclosure, clubbing, and openness, depending on who is actually commoning. So it is not, or is it, only typical for those low-income groups or those that are in need of housing. And the other case from Belgrade is about emerging resistance to investor urbanism, which is typical more or less for big housing estates, which then actually is taken as lived space. So people there develop their routines in using some space, and they want to actually defend their right to use the space. Maybe the most visible example was the Fifth Park resistance, when there was a huge investment in office space planned by the local authorities that would jeopardize the whole green area, including the wood cutting. So the local people, the local residents, actually organized quite well, and they have a success, had a success in the phase of resistance. So a kind of urgent demand to defend their place unified very different social actors. But on the other hand, they didn't have success in deciding about what with that space which they had defended, how to design, how to develop it, etc. So it was left at that moment without any further action. Here again, I wanted to say something, to remind us something about problems of collective actions. So famous tragedy of commons, that it is very hard to actually have permanent action by very different people within the city and its heterogeneity, and of course the payoffs for the individuals who invest in commons, which actually is very small in the long run. And yes, one of the presumptions for social movements to last or to have to have a greater success is to keep networking, to cooperate, which is very contingent matter, not only due to the diversified social actors, heterogeneity, but also due to some kind of culture of civic activism, which is, I think, in post-socialist countries, some of them, here in Serbia, sure, not that developed. And at the end, yeah, I want to stress the idea of just city, which was very popular during the period of welfare state and clear state role in housing. In a way, this concept also shifted. So from a fair distribution to social differentiation without exclusion. And this has also its reasoning or rationalization in Lefebvre's right to the city, which is now interpreted solely as a right to difference. Susan Feinstein actually wrote a book on this, and she now wants to reinterpret this kind of concept of a just city, although she is very keen with the role of the distribution of the state. But she said the just city is one that is socially inclusive, where difference is not merely tolerated but treated with recognition and respect. That is something that is needed to say in order not to be superficial. And also what she also wanted to say is that the outcomes of the process of urban planning is very important. So we have to ask ourselves who benefits from some project, to what extent, and to see are there and what are the constraints that are emerging from structural inequalities, and not just to the process of participation, which is very often very superficial or, as I say, ideal of social justice, change for procedural justice. So there is procedure of that is democratic, participative, etc., but actually no sustainable participation at all. So and these have, of course, effects that we can see as deprived marginal actors have difficulties to fit, to impose entrepreneurial agenda. So in this kind of approach of entrepreneurial city and all the changes that are accompanying it in housing, the people are actually expected to be organized, in communication with institutions, to be actors that are, so to say, entrepreneurial enough and literacy, having the competences to have a dialogue with institutions and negotiate with them in order to defend their projects. For mega projects, having evaluated also this kind of a problem, Susan Feinstein, for instance, insists that they should be subjected to heightened scrutiny, that they should be required to provide direct benefits to low-income people in the form of employment provisions, public amenities, and a living wage, and if public subsidy is involved, which is mostly the case one way or another, they should include public participation in the profits. And this is the last slide, when I actually want to open the question about urban commons, and it is, as also you said, something between market and state, or one of the titles was moving beyond market and state, in a way that we see this kind of stress on organization and entrepreneurial spirit of all actors. So a kind of formalization of the rules and decision making is required. And the very complex issue of governance of the cities is often cross-sectoral and cross-color. So you have to have relations with the state, with the region, or with the European Union, etc. So, as Kit said, there is a constant risk to be colonized by market or the state logic. So this is a kind of context that we should have in mind. Feinstein, on the other hand, stressing the redistributive mechanism of social exchange is very important, because, for instance, Polanyi made the distinctions between market exchange, redistribution of the state, and the reciprocity of the civil society. So all of three actually are inevitable in any society. It is a question of their combination and so to say synergy of them. So in regulation theory we have more insisting about public-private partnership. Is it the solution to make more emphasis on public-civil partnership? And also I want to stress that we in a post-socialist contexts are facing big challenges in any of these partnerships because of the double weakness of the state, which is not developed enough to implement participation, democracy, collaborative planning, etc., and also the civil sector, which is without tradition in maybe generating actually the civic engagement enough. That would be all. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us to present our sphere of interest. We had an opportunity to have an insight on other abstracts, so we switched from the examples of Latin America to more European, to give an overview of the struggles that are coming from the struggles for housing as a commons, and to see where they meet some different policies and what can be done. So, as mentioned before, the massive privatization, the neoliberalization, the home ownership dominates in majority of southern and eastern European countries. In Serbia particularly, the housing crisis caused by the rapid privatization of socially owned housing stock after 1990s left the market to regulate the housing issue, and it was followed by the commodification of housing. The government stopped almost entirely to invest into the public housing, and furthermore, the provision and maintenance of housing in Serbia shifted from public sector to individuals, not even a private sector like the case in other European countries. For example, the Constitution of Republic of Serbia does not even contain a right to housing or any other similar right. So there are some provisions regarding housing. For instance, it's the right to ownership of the property and the right to inheritance. In the Housing Act from 1992 actually make a very favorable conditions to privatize the whole housing stock, and step by step it brought us to a situation that Serbia now owns 0.8 of total housing stock is public apartments. Belgrade concretely is 1%, which means 1,700 flats, from which 700 are for social housing. Basically nothing. So for example, Vienna has 25%, which in numbers is 100,000 flats, and Zurich is less than 10% privately owned. So if we are talking, for example, about purchasing the household, according to the Ministry of Construction, Transportation and Infrastructure, in 2017, the ratio of house prices to average household income in Serbia was 10:1 if you want to buy the flat in cash. If you want to buy it by the loan, then it's 14:1, and all those numbers are far above the 5:1 ratio, considered the limit above which people cannot meet their housing needs without institutional support. Also, the latest data from Eurostat statistics shows that 65% of the households in Serbia are heavily financially burdened with the housing costs, which makes Serbia the second in Europe. Unfortunately, the situation is accompanied by the abolition of housing funds and the absence of any kind of housing policies, systemic measures, and support mechanism, especially for endangered households. And this was stated in the National Social Housing Strategy in 2012, that the state almost completely withdraws from its housing, led by, among other things, the global ideological assumption that the job in the housing sector for the state is terminated because there is no longer a significant housing shortage, and that the sector should be left exclusively to the market laws. This came 1 year after the census for population, households and dwellings in 2011, which shows that Belgrade has 1.65 million inhabitants, and it has a actually housing shortage of 120,000 households. The year after the national strategy, the media was covered with the news that it's impossible to provide an apartment, household, to majority of the people. Actually, it was stated as a mission impossible because the average salary was around 320 and the average price of the flat was 1,400. The action of the government came in 2014. The Prime Minister, nowadays the President, announced the initiative that 50,000 to 100,000 affordable housing units for 400 euros per square meter will be constructed on the state-owned land by commercial developer, while the loans will be given free of interest. And the proposal came with the remark that only foreign companies will have the capacities to put this out, like the ones coming from the United Arab Emirates. And this was in May 2014. In June 2014, we received this from United Arab Emirates. So 2 million square meters of mixed use, where the price of the residential buildings goes above 3,000 euros per square meter. So this project brings around 6,000 units, average size 135 square meters, and you need around 80 annual salaries to pay off the apartment. And just to mention that prior to this intervention, 250 families was reallocated from this area, either to the periphery of Belgrade, either without leaving them with any solution or some kind of short-term solution, but Danilo knows that much better. And the final consequences of having this kind of, or actually not having any kind of housing regulation are the evictions. So the newest law on housing, building maintenance and social housing, which was enacted at the end of 2016, made evictions practically the primary means in resolving different legal real estate issues. So according to the report of the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe, in many cases, the authorities failed to comply, I'm quoting this, failed to comply the legal standards when conducting the evictions. Moreover, in many cases, the legal remedies for challenging the decision on the evictions were not provided, while the authorities destroyed property of the evicted individuals without any compensation. The reasons for those forcible deprivation of the apartments were numerous. Either investor was selling several times to the different people the same flat. You know, the cases that started in 2002 to 2004 with Stankom company, for example, and the first initiative that was called 1,000 or 100 Deceived. Then through the inability to pay the invoice bills, the loans, or some other debt situation, the illegal construction, and also the missing documents in transfer of the ownership, which is related to the privatization of the companies. And the reasons are different, but the results are always the same, and that's the many people left without the roof over their heads. According to the report that was made in 2016, made by the European Action Coalition for Right to Housing and the City, in period of between 2009 and 2013, more than 20 large-scale forced evictions happened in the informal Roma settlements, which affected around 3,000 persons. At least 100 families living in the social housing are facing the forced eviction. Privatization of publicly owned companies has left hundreds of workers and their families in imminent risk. There are no national statistics about how many people are evicted. In many cases, the alternative accommodation is not provided, and the Serbian legal system does not provide tenants with the proper security of tenure. And what happened as a reaction on this, and also I forgot to mention the private executors that became like a new force of the government, and they radicalized the situation even more. As a reaction to this, through 2017 and 2018, a left-wing initiative titled Joint Action Roof Over the Head, ili Združena akcija Krov nad glavom, and some of those people are here, and I'm very glad to see you here, actually gather the individuals and organizations that are struggling for the right to housing. They are known as the people who are applying the direct action method in solidarity struggles. And thanks to this group, the problem of forced evictions and ensuring the homelessness has become recognized widely in Serbia. There were several groups before that who were also trying to stop evictions for workers in Trudbenik, for example, and so on. But this initiative brought several organizations and more than 100 individuals, activists, who are prevented more than 150 repossessions through the mass direct action. Home ownership, the commodification of housing, and all the things that I've mentioned before are not something that is particular only for our country, and more specific, the dramatic, they were most dramatic in Spain, actually, with the consequences of high-risk loans and home ownership based on the mortgages. Basically made the situation that 700,000 families had to face the process of mortgage execution since 2008 to, this was from the report made in 2018. According to Spanish General Council, there have been more than 500,000 evictions, which makes 170 per day, which actually makes each one in 8 minutes. So every 8 minutes that they had one of the evictions. Spanish government reduced the public budget to housing for 63%. They also stayed with 3.5 billion dwellings empty. The rent prices increased for 40%. 11% of people cannot afford the basic utilities, and the social housing accounts for only 2% of the housing market. As a reaction to this situation, there was the movement emerged in 2009, and this is like the largest social movement for right to housing, Plataforma de Afectados por la Hipoteca, that has 240 chapters around Spain, the massive assembly-based movement, known as well now because one of their activists became mayor of Barcelona, and actually pushed new laws into Catalan government, which I think it's very important. So through the direct action campaigns and the pressuring banking institutions and government entities, and also by occupying buildings, PAS succeeded to stop more than 2,000 evictions and to house around 3,000 people. But what is the new thing is the law that they brought to the Congress on housing, which was supported by almost 2 million citizens, and they succeeded to change the Catalan law and provide Catalans with another opportunity. The law has 5 main points, and those are these points here. So, deed in lieu for foreclosure, the cancellation of debt by handing back the property of the mortgaged house to the bank. The second one is affordable rents. So the regulation of rent prices with a reference index, like in Paris and Berlin, and it's taking into consideration the location, size of property, the previous rental agreements, and so on. The third point, stop the evictions, a moratorium on evictions on first and only residence of vulnerable families. Social housing, to give public administration the ability to temporarily use the vacant houses owned by the banks and the big landlords that remain unjustifiably vacant for more than 6 months. And the grant and basic utilities to outload supplies interruptions for basic utilities such as water, gas, and so on. And thanks to the political pressure and the social pressure, LAPA law entered the Spanish Congress after 9 months of negotiation in September 2018, and now it's been in procedure. Thank you. Now Jovana will continue.
Yes, this law proposal that Eva talked about just now leads us to another level of struggle, of course not disconnected from the one of direct action, that produces more systemic solutions, whether we are talking about policies or concrete housing models. Of course, within a limited time of the presentation, we will just name a few of such examples. So, okay. So one is La Borda in Barcelona in Spain. Based on the model grant of use, La Borda represents an experimental practice of establishing a cooperative housing, looking after other similar models, such as Fuqvam, that Stavros was just really elaborating in Uruguay. In November 2015, Barcelona City Council has established a leasehold, like a contract of lease, that allowed the La Borda cooperative to use the plot located in Canbatlio. It's a former industrial site, now classified as a state-subsidized housing, for 75 years by paying an annual fee that has a limit in increase, so it can remain accessible to the cooperative and cooperative members. The cooperative is based on the approach where the property, so I mean the built structure, the land is public. So the built structure always remains collective property, and Stavros also mentioned that question, while the use is personal. That's why it's grant of use model. So residents have the status of cooperative partners and can live there for life, but it's a collective ownership, and in that way built structure is kind of a commons, works as a commons. Also, something that Stavros also mentioned when talking about Uruguay is that the General Assembly is this participative nature that goes all along the process, you know, from the planning to the managing of the housing. So the General Assembly represents the main sovereign institution where decisions are made. What such model allows is to eliminate property speculation and extracting profit on a fundamental right like housing. So members cannot sell or rent the units, just use them. And another specific feature of this example, particular, because it's not always an opportunity to go from scratch and to build from scratch, is that, I'm sorry, is the very process of creating and building that was highly participative. So future users could define the entire project according to their needs. They offer the structure of the budget, which might be also interesting and useful for other activists. The budget for building La Borda adds up to 2.7 million euros, but the funding comes from various resources, mainly from the inhabitants' financial contributions that are also according to their financial capacities. They're not equal among themselves, and voluntary contributions made by collaborative members, meaning non-profit organizations or funds, and the financial support of ethic and social funding institutions. Another example that we wanted to talk about is Miethäuser Syndicat, because it shows another type of model that might be interesting. It represents a network or a union, as the title implies, of self-organized collective housing projects. It is a non-profit investment organization that supports common purchase of housing units. It was formed in 1989 by former squatters and housing activists in Freiburg, but obviously has spread throughout Germany with the project they support. Their 1992 statute states that their goal is to support the genesis and achieve political acceptance of self-organized house projects, decent living space, and roof over the head for everybody. Each of the house projects within the network is autonomous, so it's a separate enterprise. It has a legal status, so each of the housing projects has a legal status of a limited liability company, which was their choice according to the local German legislative framework, because it gave them the opportunity to actually use in practice everything that they imagined. So the 140 projects and 18 project initiatives differ in terms of size, location, mortgage volume, number of tenants, but what is common is that all projects are self-organized, and the syndicate has a financial interest in every house in order to prevent sellouts, while all projects also have committed themselves to making contributions to this joint solidarity fund that they have, which they reinvest in new projects. The syndicate, in its role as a control organization, is a partner in every house with purpose that any of these limited liability companies could not be dissolved or misused unilaterally by just one partner. Similarly, but focused more on land issue rather than the built structure, is the next example, which is the Community Land Trust in Brussels. But a Community Land Trust is more of a model. We're just using the one that is in Brussels, but it has been spread around Europe. so beyond Belgium. So what was interesting when we were analyzing this is that housing policy in Belgium is in a way similar to Serbian because it's largely focused on the support of home ownership. So it has a very small percentage, as Eva was mentioning, of the publicly owned homes. And at the same time, between year 2000 and 2010, in Brussels region, housing prices have doubled. And although the demand for social housing increased, hardly any new public housing was built. So the Community Land Trust in Brussels was formally established in 2012 as an initiative led by activists from several existing housing and neighborhood associations. And it was established to serve, of course, all the Brussels, but especially with emphasis on the least privileged communities. An essential purpose of the Community Land Trust was is to provide access to land and, of course, housing and economic opportunities for low and moderate income people who otherwise, in the context that we were all talking about already, have no access to the resources or to the housing solutions. By making the ownership of land collective, so they are focused on owning land, and the housing, their ownership of housing individual, it wants to give local communities more control over the neighborhoods. In all projects, Community Land Trust seeks a balance between the individual interest of the residents and the general interest of the communities. They claim that they are trying to actually have this holistic approach to the neighborhoods, and that's why in their boards they're always including future owners of the dwellings, residents of the neighborhood, and the civil society and government also representatives. I mean, we can discuss if that model works or not, but it's just a relevant thing for discussion. Having in mind the scale of the housing situation, so the struggle for housing includes joining wider networks beyond the local and national context. We will just mention two, again because of the time, two networks that we think are important. One is MOBA. So the collective from Serbia who built the city has been working on the subject of cooperative housing for years and has, within a specific project of smarter building, invested effort to establish and realize first contemporary housing cooperative in Serbia. In order to join forces and build capacities through exchange with other regional similar initiatives, they have formed a MOBA housing network that gathers organizations from Budapest, Belgrade, Ljubljana, Zagreb, and Prague. They aim to start the first community-led housing cooperatives in their countries as potentially replicable models that can challenge an inadequate provision of housing. Sharing the same structural constraints and similar political context, they have gathered to collectively create access to tailored financial resources, to share skills, knowledge, and specific expertise, not only in construction, but also in financial, legal, and organizational aspects, and to challenge and change unsupportive legal frameworks, thus influencing policy and practice. Okay, yeah, it's getting there. Just one mention, it's Eva mentioned their analysis. It's a European Action Coalition for the Right to Housing into the City. I won't go into explaining what they are. Their latest brochure on housing financialization from 2018 makes an important point that housing movements need to look for structural economic causes of the housing situation, such as capital accumulation by dispossession, uneven development, and the politics of market fundamentalism. And I'm in a conclusion. So naming this presentation Struggle for Housing as Commons, Eva and I try to emphasize the commoning aspect that comes from the very struggles for different housing conditions in this hyper-commodification that we are facing, as David Madden and Peter Marcuse would put it in their book In Defense of Housing. This is not to say that they do not have problems, I mean, these struggles, and we can also have use the discussion to to critically examine these examples. But still, what we would like to point out are just a few things. Firstly, whether we are talking about the direct action of stopping an eviction or auction or other material or immediate urgent manifestations of housing situation, or we refer to struggles that look for more systemic solutions through research and practical models, or we talk about transnational networks that local initiatives establish in order to address widely or more wider structural causes of housing situation. All these levels of struggles are needed, and they're needed simultaneously. They're not only transformative as they're creating political subjects and strengthening those who join the struggle, but they're also proving that other forms of production and social relations are possible, and they are in fact achieving some reforms and changes in the present system. And that is certainly not to be underestimated. But having said that, the struggle for decommodification and recommunalization of housing has to be based on understanding that housing situations is not a temporary crisis in capitalism that could be solved by a number of legislative measures or improvements. Rather, it is a normal, expected consequence of capital's regulation and expansion. In line with Engels' argument in Housing Question from 1872, where he states, quote, as long as the capitalist mode of production continues to exist, it is folly to hope for a solution to the housing question or of any other social question concerning workers, end quote. So in line with that, we could also not expect for the housing situation or this permanent crisis, as Madden and Marcuse suggest, to be resolved under capitalism. Struggle for housing, therefore, has to refer to a broader horizon and also join with other struggles that share the same structural cause, whether it is a struggle for recommunalization of water resources, access to health services, and other similar struggles. Finally, what struggle for the right to housing needs to incorporate is a more radical understanding of the right itself, drawing from Lefebvre's concept of the right to the city, which was mentioned before. Demanding housing for all does not mean merely ensuring everyone has a shelter, but also beyond that to allow access and participation in decision-making and management of housing. So beyond the legal demands, it has to include these immensely important political ones as well. Sorry.
Now, Danilo, you could tell us a little bit more about the legal framework and that is already.
Yes, actually, this was a great introduction to what I wanted to say. I don't have the presentation. I'm sorry. I don't have the presentation. It's just actually the photos that will go, I think, in a slideshow, I guess. I think a lot of people before me actually just spoke about housing situation in Serbia as a consequence of privatization of housing stock and this transition that is never ending actually since 90s, and all this actually understanding of housing as a commodity rather than a right. What I would like to speak about is actually the interplay between the urban commoning and human rights in all these urban struggles. Actually, we had the opportunity to listen about tonight. Actually, and all of this actually from the perspective of Roma housing in Serbia. So I think Eva actually mentioned the number of forced evictions we had in Belgrade since 2009 until 2012. 13, actually, it was more than 3,000 people that were forcibly evicted by the city administration. And that is just one part of the problem, because at this point there is around 600 informal Roma settlements that were actually built as a result of this exclusion and discrimination that Roma face in different areas of life, but actually in housing as well. So we have 600 informal Roma settlements, and at least 1/5 of them are in Belgrade at this point. So these settlements are completely secluded from from other parts of towns of Belgrade. Actually, they are without basic infrastructure in most of the cases, without adequate access to different services, but also people living in these settlements are actually at constant risk of forced evictions. Again, in some cases, these people actually were left homeless as a consequence of these infrastructural projects that were actually built in Belgrade. But in some other, actually, they were also provided with some kind of accommodation that was made for them, let's say. So we have two different ways of actually providing these people with accommodation. So one is actually, let's say, the school example of the segregation in housing. It's the establishment of these container settlements for Roma people. So they are actually something similar to what in Italy we saw with this nomad plan. So actually they just put Roma in. So this is the picture actually of one of these settlements. So they just put Roma in one part of the, this is actually one of the, so it's 14.8 square meters of metal container without any infrastructure in the container, but actually with joint water supply and toilet as well. Again, what was the consequence of all these forced evictions is actually that Roma are still living in most of these informal settlement actually, and in constant risk of forced evictions. But then, in cases when they were provided with housing, they were provided with well, I wouldn't even say housing in these cases. It's some kind of an accommodation that is clearly not in line with Serbian constitution, but also international human rights standards. Another problem is that actually in some cases that also people were actually provided with social housing, like the regular social housing in Belgrade. We witnessed a lot of cases where people are actually not able to pay their utility costs because in most of the cases actually utility costs are around one, let's say in Zemun Polje, which is one of the biggest actually social housing communities there. We have families that are actually having the same amount of social assistance as the amount of their utility costs they have to pay. So actually in these cases they pick to eat something, not to pay the electricity. And then by not paying this, actually we are getting into this situation that they are going to be evicted from this social housing again and actually back to the street, let's say. And all these things are actually just proving that systemically there is a huge problem with the how situation in housing stock and all this withdrawal of the state actually from its social roles actually affected the most vulnerable communities. And then if we compare this with the question actually, or if we ask ourselves how the cities are being developed in last decades, we can see that there are actually two different. There is also something that could be used for us to better understand actually where is the interplay between urban commoning and all this human rights framework we are using here. The thing is that actually. If you read all these UN documents and all these commitments, and especially sustainable development goals and all these kind of very nice and shiny political commitments from the UN, we will see that we could actually get the impression that we live in some kind of era of inclusion, desegregation, and everything is nice and everything is working. But then if you actually look into the ways how the cities are being developed, that is completely contrary. So, for example, we have this whole idea of inclusive cities in the SDG 11, for example, but then at the same time we have hundreds of thousands of people living in informal settlement slums without any kind of infrastructure and without any kind of access to basic services. Again, there is for example, when it comes to refugees, there is the out-of-camp policy for refugees. That the UNHCR developed, but then refugees are not really actually able to get accommodation or housing on the market or actually anywhere else than in collective centers. So there are different, these kind of actually proclamations, and then the implementation of all these policies are actually not meeting in these cases. So again, this is kind of like if you read the documents, you will see this. But then actually, if you look into the reality, you will see that we have all these informal Roma settlements, different issues that we are dealing with when it comes to housing of vulnerable groups. And then if we want to put on top of this international human rights standards that we use to understand what is the right to adequate housing, and actually what does it mean to have the adequate housing in accordance to all these international human rights documents, then we will see that actually international human rights standards are not good enough for us to understand what is happening and how our cities are being developed. Because if you look into so this is kind of technical issue, but I guess, and the kind of lawyering as well, but I guess it will not be very boring. But the thing is that the first interpretative tool that was developed under the International Covenant of Economic and Social Rights that provide us all with the right to adequate housing was this General Comment 4 that provided some kind of criteria for housing that actually housing has to meet in order to be adequate. But it doesn't speak about, it speaks about different aspects as the access to basic services, infrastructure, accessibility, affordability, cultural adequacy, and all these different issues, but it doesn't speak about the quality of housing. And then actually doesn't say anything about what is the essence of adequate housing. So if you look into this accidental development of cities, let's say, actually, if you look into this, how rich and poor communities are being developed, how the city planning is actually affecting the right to adequate housing and access to basic services to other people, you will see that this international human rights standards is not actually adequate for us to understand that segregation in housing and development of rich communities and actually communities where access to basic services and goods and other rights as well is much better than the access for someone who lives in Zemunpoje, for example. So if you put, for example, let's say like this, if you put Roma from one settlement to another place and say, okay, you live here and this is the settlement where you have to live, this is actually Roma-only settlement, international human rights standards will say, okay, this is contrary to human rights provisions and to our constitution, because this is actually situation where when you directly wanted to put people in this, you wanted to isolate them. But then if you look into the development of cities and how rich and poor communities are being actually differently developed and how more investments are being actually put into these neighborhoods where people who are better off live, then the international human rights standards will not be able to say, okay, this is contrary to international, this is contrary to anything, to actually your commitments from the covenant or anything else. And I think there is actually the place, if you look into these things, there is a place for us to rethink actually the ways how the urban commoning and how actually how these social relations we want to actually build into in our cities are feeding into this struggle for adequate housing and actually feeding into this struggle for demanding the right to the city that is going to be really inclusive, but not inclusive in a way that it's inclusive for some of us, but not actually for everyone. That is actually I think very briefly what I wanted to mention. I think, yeah, we can discuss this later on if you think there is a kind of something else we should bring into this discussion. But I believe that actually what these social relations are is actually that is what we want to. We have to decide actually. Do we want to have inclusive cities or not? Do we want to have cities where someone lives in 14.8 square meters in container like this? Or we want to see the city where actually people are participating and also being asked and actually also being responsible for management of the housing, not just housing, but actually the management of the ways how we operate when we develop cities. So that is actually the question, I think, where we can learn from these two areas of yeah, our works, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you. So, thank you, all of you. And now I would like to encourage both you, the participants, and our guests to ask some questions, because that was the main purpose. You can also ask each other questions.
Encourage them more.
You will get.
Maybe they're just tired. Maybe 1 hour.
Hi. Well, yeah, I just wanted to break the ice. I'm one of the members of the organization that Eva mentioned, Združena Akcija. Actually, we do not have like an official membership. It's mostly organizations. Can you hear me? I think everyone can hear me. So we do not have official organization. It's more like a loosen up organization formed by a lot of left-wing organizations as well as individuals. And in order to kind of impose a question and the necessity of a question that everyone deserves to have a roof above their head. So as Eva mentioned, we've been doing for the past 2 years a lot of direct actions to like simply stop for, what's their name? I think it's quite odd. So it's like a public profession, but it's actually private. So the people, like we call them
Private executors.
Private executors, but public executionists or whatever. They have assistance with the state. So the question of, like, let's say it housing and like simply having the right for home, as you already mentioned, is quite complex, taking into consideration that we do not have official public housing policies. They've been completely demolished, and like the historical specificity of the development of Yugoslavia was quite different than other welfare states across Europe. So taking that into consideration, the private property was basically the main factor that is actually causing for, let's say it, I'm sorry, I just wanted to break the ice and like kind of yeah.
You managed.
So people are getting evicted from their homes because I would say crazy things such as like even illegal made debts. Banks and state are working together on this occasion, and we are dealing with a lot of problems, simply pointing out the problem that we have, and that is the social problem of having your own home or simply living somewhere. So Združena Akcija is kind of tending, and our best, I think, result was that we put this question more broadly, and public is becoming more interested in that question. So I think the Združena Akcija and other organizations as well, with what they're doing, are simply putting more focus on the problem of housing today. But yeah, I think it would be good to discuss more about this. So yeah.
Thank you, Jelena. I have a question.
Somebody.
But there is no mic. So.
I don't know which presentation talked about Mietvereins-Syndikat. So at the moment I live in Germany, and I live in a part of the town of Berlin that got highly gentrified over the last 20 years. So when I came to the town, this was a Muslim immigrant area. Nobody actually wanted to live there, of the white Christian people. And now it got to be like the super cool area that got very, very expensive. And there is a new, very cynical way of displacement happening within the meets renting agreements, and this is the so-called modernization. So the imposed modernization of the city of Berlin is bringing the rents so much higher than the actually salary or any kind of salary that you can somehow earn within 1 month. And of course this is hitting very hard to the immigrant families with kids or other kinds of immigrant aliens, but also like white German divorced mothers, for example. They are hit by poverty very, very hard. So I wanted to ask something more about this Mietverein-Syndikat, because it looked for me like a block of ideology that actually is not really protecting people at the moment, at least in Berlin, and in some other towns I'm not familiar with, but maybe we can talk about it.
Okay, yeah, I mean, we did mention that because we thought that it was interesting just to have that as a model to discuss, that there is this joint organization, yeah, I mean, a joint effort to invest in housing and take it off the market. And to, in that way, to somehow grow in that, unionized housing project. I mean, that was partly why we investigated it, just, as a model of co-housing. So, of course, it might be, as we mentioned also, with all of these examples, that they are not resistant to these kind of urban processes that you are talking about, of course. And also Professor Petrovic also mentioned this, the risk of co-opting all these new practices, or I mean, I don't like the word the alternative, but these other practices. So it might be that they are also not resistant to that, but as I said, the reason why we were starting to analyze it, as it was because of this like economic model, primarily economic model of taking off, the units, the housing units, taking them off the market, and having some kind of rent control that would allow for people who don't have access to housing to have it.
Yeah, my question was about. Yeah, sorry. So who are the members of the syndicate?
Anybody can be. So Mietshäuser Syndicate is a kind of a roof organization that has around 200 buildings in Germany, and now they're spreading around also in the German-speaking areas such as Austria and so on. And each building can become the member of the syndicate. So we can here register a cooperative and say we need a protection in some way, so we will become the members of the association. And we also don't have money to buy the building, so we need your help. They have the reinvestment fund, which is called like that, collecting money from their members, and they give you the half of the money. Like you have the way to invest. You can also get some loan from the ethical banks, which are giving the loans without interest, which is also kind of helping the situation. And within your building, you are completely free to manage it as you want, but there are the rules as a Mietshäuser association. So that's how it functions. Yes.
That's the syndicate.
No, it's called Mietshäuser. That's the word.
But the syndicate is probably the Genossenschaften. That means the tenants are able to organize by themselves. But it's not so easy to enter these kind of Genossenschaften mostly you have like private rents, and there is no organization between the tenants.
No. It's not the same thing.
Yeah, there are two different things.
Yes, yes.
We're talking about Mietgenossenschaften, which are more like caring about their tenants.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
But also in order to come to be a part of the Genossenschaften, it's like a huge action to get into that structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think
that's what you're saying.
Hi, all. Thank you very much for all of your talks.
We have a question over there.
I have a question for each and every one of you separately. For Danilo, I was wondering, you mentioned the term inclusive city, you used specifically that term, and you tried to kind of like speak about the Roma housing in the terms of inclusion and exclusion. So I was wondering what is the relationship between these two concepts, inclusive city on one side and just city on the other side, and how these two concepts correspond. So this is one. And then for Mina, I was wondering, it's like a thought experiment. Could we think about self-management and let's say Yugoslav housing provision and societal property as a way of commoning? Can we use the term commoning to think about this kind of historical experiment that happened like after the Second World War, in sense of like on the one side nationalization and on the other side the housing provision that was provided through factories that were actually supposed to be self-managed, no? And also like this kind of like help models like based on solidarity funds and so on. So this is one. And then on the other side, uncommoning of what is happening to us now in terms of restitution, privatization, and expropriation that we are witnessing. So this is it. And then for Eva and Jovana, the question is, I mean, you focused a lot on different things. I mean, but basically you focused on cooperative housing as a kind of like alternative model. But you didn't, I mean, you also focused on Spain, on Barcelona, particularly on La Paz, Barcelona do Como, but you didn't mention squatting in any kind of way. Neither of you did, which is really interesting because, I mean, a lot of things has been written about commoning and squatting. So anyway, I was interested, do you have any information about how this kind of municipal government law of La Paz is dealing with the problems of squatting and illegalization of squats? There is a research that is done by the group called Obra Social in Barcelona that is showing that there is like thousands of families that are squatting at this moment in Barcelona. I could talk a lot about this, but I would like leave you to answer this question. And then for Stavros, I was wondering, can you tell us something about? I mean, I read that there was this like change of policy in migration, and that the migrants will need to leave the collective accommodations that they are using now in Greece. I mean, there are particular rules that were established earlier, but now they will be put in power. That means that they will have to like find their accommodation independently, you know, on the market. And commoning, migration, and squatting is also one of particularly important topics in Greece. It has been for a long time. So I was wondering, are there any discussions around this new situation? Because now in Greece you're going to have like much more people in need of urgent accommodation, and yeah, are people discussing this? How, yeah, is there any particular like solution regarding what's happening? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I used inclusive city as I think actually as a replication of what was this idea of inclusive cities under the SDGs that are actually trying to kind of make us thinking of different. I think actually when it comes to these SDGs, one of the big problems is actually that they are kind of watering down the obligations of the state, which is actually the main, I think, the main goal of them, of all these sustainable development goal is actually just not to speak about the rights and the obligations, but to speak about the commitments and actually kind of objectives, which is quite different thing, right? So inclusive city in that way, in a way, how it is used and how it is understood in SDGs. But I think actually we are not, when we speak about our cities and we speak about Belgrade as one of the examples, include like and this whole concept of inclusion, I would say, is I'm not even sure actually where to start, you know, because it's the so there is a strategy on Roma inclusion, for example, but the strategy is being produced by non-Roma people, for example. So this kind of like understanding of inclusion. So how we understand some other people should be included, and that's actually the main issue. I think that if we want to reach this idea of just city and actually the city that is for everyone, then we have to, first thing would actually to start understanding actually what are the problems and what are the needs, and actually acknowledging the needs of all these communities, different groups of people and different struggles, and then starting actually discussing how we're going to actually change this. But at this point we're not having any kind of we're not even living in the same cities. I think actually that the people that are having all these struggles and people that are not living in the same city at this point. So that was, I'm not sure actually if it's a bit more clear what I meant when I said inclusive city, but yeah.
Yeah, it's my turn. About the self-management during socialism, is it a kind of commoning practice? Well, in the concept, at the concept level, we can make some overlapping. Even Lefebvre was very pleased to recognize that a certain society in Europe is developing a concept of self-management, and he visited here and made a lecture about self-management, and so conceptually that was very attractive. Yes, we were specific as having the provision of flats. That responsibility was given to the enterprises, but the practice was quite different, and the fact that actually the flats were distributed to those with expert position, with position of managers, directors, etc., while those with lower incomes or lower education or of less significance for the system or for the enterprises were actually waiting for a flat for decades, or were forced to practice the exit strategies I was talking about. So it was not something that would be inclusive or participative to define the needs, to see who is in need and to actually help them in order to make a kind of common project and distribute housing in that way. So in practice it was really far from the commoning concept.
Hi, it's our turn.
Thank you.
So yes, I actually mentioned that the Lapa occupied the buildings. I didn't use the term squatting, but I said occupied buildings where they housed 3,000 families. Adakala also comes from the squatting scene, which is kind of also connected, and Spain has a history of squatting very well developed. I mean, I think that more than 50% of Baskia is squatted. If you open the map of squats in Baskia, you would see that the whole area is covered with red dots. They even succeeded to make a completely new autonomous village where they occupied 200 buildings, providing housings for different vulnerable groups. I spoke so many times about squatting, so I thought maybe just to skip this time talking about that, just to see what are the alternatives. But yeah, we can go from there. Yeah, majority of cooperatives in Europe are actually having the history in the squatting scene. Even not only in like La Borda, yes, as well. I mean, the examples in Switzerland have the history in the squatting scene, which they succeeded also to make new kind of cooperatives, which are now presenting 30% of the whole housing sector in, for example, canton of Zurich. In Amsterdam was the situation that they succeeded to give more than 200 buildings and lands to house around 50,000 people, which is also a huge number. So through years it became a regulation. In the northern countries, I think because of the will to control the process, and in the southern it was something that is developing in parallel to the system, like in Greece with the cases that exist in Thessaloniki, especially with Viome, with solidarity hospitals, with cooperatives, and so on.
Just to
Next time I will focus on
Big market demand.
The question was, what is the relationship of La Paz government, like people
Yeah, yeah.
who are in the municipality towards the people who are squatting now? It is really like particular, not about the history of squatting.
No, but from the occupying the vacant buildings where they were housing the people, they actually made one of the points of the law that went to the Congress on the national level, and which succeeded to be part of the Catalan regional level. I thought that they might, through the municipalist platforms and the local level of decision making, to push the law and to give the vacant buildings to the people in danger, which they didn't succeed because the laws are bringing on the regular and the national, and they were stopped several times by a popular party, but at the end they succeeded to manage that on the level of the region of Catalonia. And now there is I mean, now it's in the progress in the parliament for the national level.
Yes. First of all, the examples I gave from Latin America, not the Fukvam examples, but the Brazilian and the Mexican, are starting through squatting. They occupy the land, and they use this as a form of demand and also as a form of blackmail. I believe that negotiations with the state can take the form of agreements or whatever forms of finding a kind of equilibrium between different powers, but they can also take the form of direct blackmail of the state. And I think this is important to understand in Latin America. We are not dealing with a society in which the poor are ready to choose some representatives and go to the parliament and hope that they will manage at last to become powerful enough to make the state take care of them. This is another thing, and I think we should learn from that. Because the strong belief in the state, especially in the former welfare state countries, has completely demobilized people, has completely destroyed the possibility of people claiming the rights. And I saw that, I mean, various talks that I have given in these countries, Sweden, for example, but also in Germany, there is a strong belief that in the end, the state is there to help them. So unless you get freed from that, you are bound to repeat the circle. And I'm afraid that I should mention also that what you had here in Yugoslavia was, at least in principle, at least as a concept, the only so-called socialist country that was talking about the state in a different way. Not the state as the sovereign good father, but the state as something else. It was talking about it like that. It was not really doing it. But some of its aspects can really teach us a lot.
Yeah, but we have a long tradition of
weak states?
No, weak state. No. The culture is like the state is strong, you know, and the state is principal authority.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes, but it's interesting that inside this process, which started after the establishment of Yugoslavia as a socialist country, inside this process there were voices for the withering of the state, which is supposed to be a Marxist approach that we forgot. Okay. Talking about the situation in Greece concerning the problem of the migrants and the refugees, it's a huge problem. And it has deeply affected not only responses from the racist and the Nazi party campaigns, but also it has deeply affected the anarchist and the leftist movement, not simply on an ideological level, which is obvious, of course they should be in support of the people, but it has also affected the way those activists really understand their contribution to the support, to the solidarity. And this contribution was from the beginning based on self-management in various forms, sometimes spontaneous, sometimes organized. This has produced a new scene of self-management in Athens, in Greece in general. And this was not always the result of a direct activist intervention. Sometimes it was coming from below, it was coming from the people. We have lots of not easily recognizable occupations in Athens right now in buildings by refugees themselves, who kind of find ways to deal with the situation. Unfortunately, 2 of them were evicted quite recently, last week. So there is a constant confrontation with the state. The state, of course, is not the state of the previous era. It has its particularities because there is a kind of social democratic administration that tries to present itself as something which it is not. Its policies are strictly, unfortunately, neoliberal, but because it is important for them to keep this kind of appearance, they want, I think, to show that at least they care for the refugees. Of course, the conditions imposed by the agreements inside the European Union and the European Union agreements with other countries don't leave any maneuver, let's say, space. So in the end, the state is, for the time being, somehow tolerating informal ways of solving the problem, but I think soon it will have to proceed to direct confrontation to existing occupations. Probably you know the example of the City Plaza Hotel, which is a kind of emblematic case. It has produced not only a shelter for people, but I think it has produced also an alternative form of organization. Unfortunately, it has its limits right now because it is difficult for people to keep their strength for so long time. But indeed, this problem is going to metastasize soon in other forms, like in ways in which refugees are organizing, not necessarily with the means and forms of solidarity that we tend to be favorable for, because you have other networks of solidarity which can be effective but also can be very oppressive and very hierarchical, the mafia type solidarity. So I don't know what the result will be out of this situation, but it's a kind of explosive condition.
Susan, you had a question?
Thanks. Well, I don't have a question for each of one, but my question is kind of inspired by all presentations, and I think it's very interesting that we had this kind of presentation which was both historically informed, like with this first period of 20s and 30s, and which was diverse, in which decentered from Europe, so we saw these practices from South America. So now I'm going to talk more about Belgrade or Yugoslavia, Serbia specifically. Now, what was interesting for me when being inspired by all this presentation is to know that really this Yugoslav period was definitely not commoning, not only because the self-management was failed in so many respects, but also because the housing practices which were produced during the socialist period were very individualistic. So both the apartments which were built in this, how to say, by the state, so for example Novi Beograd, both what was produced from the bottom, like Kaluđerica, they were, paradoxically, they were reproducing the model of living which was produced in liberal capitalism. So everyone has its own apartment, kitchen is individual, bathroom is individual, so everything is like self-sustaining housing unit. No communal kitchens, no whatever, no communal washing facilities, etc. And not only this, but every kind of this intrusion of commoning practices was in the urban areas was seen as something which should be eradicated, something which was not urban enough. So, for example, when people coming from the rural areas would I don't know, would roast peppers in Blokovi, that was seen not as this kind of emancipatory practice of commoning. It was seen something which does not belong in the city. So now, like in this new, how to say, activism. Certain aspects of activism. We had some initiatives such as Savski Nasip, for example, another initiative which was maybe not mentioned here yet, which kind of works with these practices of commoning, of coming together in these shared spaces and taking some of the stigma from some of these practices which were, for example, in the 80s or 90s still seen as not urban enough.
Uncivilized.
Yeah, like almost uncivilized. So my question would be, did we get over this stigma of some practices? Would we now look at these practices as practices of commoning, if we want to have like a communal space in Blokovi where we would have communal kitchens or something like that? Would this be seen to today something emancipatory or something which should be eradicated from the urban space? And are these initiatives, such as, for example, Savski Nasip, are they basically hipster initiatives, or do they really have potential to embrace people who have real housing problems? And maybe like a final question for you. So Združena akcija za krov nad glavom is supposed to organize a protest. So as you know, we were at some point participating in these protests which are happening on Saturday in Belgrade, and we came out with very two basic demands: stop the violent evictions and provide housing for everyone, like very basic. So we need to go in public. So this is like a hypothetical question for you. Of course, we are going to discuss this inside our initiative as well. But what would be your advice? What was Združena akcija if we go to a public protest, mass mobilization? What should be our demand? Is it like stopping forcible evictions? Is it like decriminalizing squatting? Like, what would be like clear demands which would communicate with the people and which would help us to organize mass protests? Yeah.
I just want to clarify some things, because the urbanism in Yugoslavia and the idea of this kind of new socialist city for socialist man was based on the original Marx idea of the commune, and it had its organizational how to say, elements, you know, like that were supposed to bring to something. It didn't really work out, but still, you know, like these neighborhoods were organized with the mesna zajednica. That was a facility that was like implemented in the neighborhood in order for people in the neighborhood to self-manage. I mean, we cannot just erase that history and say that it didn't exist because people couldn't bake peppers. You know, I mean.
But they were based peppers. And they had even gardens growing vegetables.
Yeah.
I too need to correct you, Srđan, just a little bit. Iskra Krstić from Mašina. Yeah. So, apart from the facilities that Anna already mentioned, a lot of shared and common spaces were actually put into designs in particular buildings. And why weren't they, in your opinion, put into practice?
Because of the strong, overwhelming idea that housing should be individual, which was coming.
Because of austerity measures and the because of the austerity measures and the lack of housing. Okay. So that people actually decided to use the common and shared spaces like laundries and other types of spaces for living instead.
Just to clarify one more thing, the communal kitchens were not connected to the apartments and the apartment buildings, but to the working place. So the communal kitchens were actually restaurants, were in the factories. And the idea was to connect everything, the working space, the living space, the leisure, and make it like a one, you know, like an organism. Yeah, but we have to make a dividing line between what was, let's say, the ideology and the ideas, and what was the practical politics and how it was put in life. Yeah, I completely agree with that, but still we cannot neglect that ideas were there and there was a framework that we could have pushed for. Could or could? We could or could? We could. There was a space for us to do something about it. Yeah. What was the question? The question was what should Združena akcija, which by the way I'm also a member of.
Can I say something?
How should we articulate this protest in this particular political moment? Whatever.
Can I contribute to this question, but I can't answer it, obviously. I think the question of commoning is not only related to the management of a certain kind of good, whether it be housing or water or whatever. I think the question of commoning as a political question has to do with forms of social organization. So one part of the things that we're dealing with is the housing question. So the housing question has to do with needs of people, and of course we support the people who are in need of houses, everywhere, in whatever way, in the most reformist way. The PA has done a marvelous job, but it's not looking towards an alternative civilization, culture, society, or city. But on the other hand, if we want to connect those struggles or this kind of urgencies to a possible situation in which new forms of social organization may arise, let us look what is happening to certain parts of the world in which those are already connected. Because in those parts, that's why I'm referring to these examples, and I'm sure there are different forms of appraisal of different examples that one could mention. In these parts of the world, those who are excluded from housing are also mobilized by their strong opposition against the society as a whole and against the city which excludes them. So let us try to learn from these experiences, because what they do is building communities of struggle for housing, but through housing, building communities of struggle. And these communities actually reinvent themselves as alternative. I don't like the word either, but let's use it for convenience. Alternative forms of social organization. This is what can be, at least to my mind, the only way that we can distinguish commoning as a process which simply integrates people or covers the leftovers of the welfare state, from commoning that can have a potentiality of going beyond existing society. There is no guarantee for that, obviously. But on the other hand, looking back at history, which transformation, which social transformation has evolved through a complete deterministic steps one to the other. I mean, lots of things were already existing in feudalism that were promising a different society, but it didn't come out exactly as the promises were, or it came out because those promises had the contradictions inherent in them, but it was the contradictory process that produced the other society. It was not the plan of somebody. I mean, capitalism was contradictory from the beginning. This is supposed to be the Marxist idea. But yes, but it exists. So let us try to see these potentialities inherent in commoning in areas, and especially in housing as common, in areas in which these practices produce new forms of social organization. These forms of social organization, of course, are in conditions that are fragile, precarious, and so on and so forth. So it's not, they cannot be established once and for all. They are in constant struggle with their surrounding. And perhaps you had these possibilities in the early period of Yugoslavia. These possibilities were created, of course, by certain decisions from above. These possibilities can be created in many ways. This was one historical example that had given these potentialities. Red Vienna has also given potentialities, which was absolutely social democratic, and it was based on the defeat of the communists. So, but it gave possibilities. The Red Vienna is one of the few examples that we have in which actually communities of workers were encircling the official city. And that you saw the map, the battles they had to fight against the Nazis. It was really protecting another city within the city. So please don't exaggerate sometimes. I know I can understand it because you felt it like a disappointment. I mean, all this history, it's full of disappointments. I mean, you get used to disappointments. But some elements can show possible different directions. Not telling you what has happened to Yugoslavia, of course, but I think that Yugoslavia had some elements from which we can learn instead of discarding everything. I don't know what you should do tomorrow.
Yeah.
I can only say that to my comrades in Greece.
Yeah, for instance, they actually abolished Modernization, am I right? Which was a kind of a framework for citizens to manage their neighborhoods. But no one opposed. Government, yeah, from above. So no one opposed. So people actually didn't feel it as something that they used to use. And I think that we are a very paradoxical society. So on one hand, we have a culture of state, national state, national question, social promotion through the state, a lot of things. And on the other hand, we have a great expectation of everyone from the state, even today. And on the other hand, those who are not privileged enough to get something from the state are actually atomized, fragmented, and developing their individual strategies. So paradox is that we have a centralized state that atomizes society. And that is actually the problem with how to make people perspective to recognize their risk, their potential risk, that they can be in a similar risky situation one day. To be evicted from their flat, or to have a solidarity, to have empathy with that situation. We are the society with extremely low trust, not in institutions. That is another paradox. So state, and then a weak trust in institutions on one hand, and in the others on the other. I think that is our huge problem. We lost
But this is what capitalism is doing to everyone.
Yes, of course. So I mean, we are reproducing something that is actually thrown on us. Well, I don't have the answer on your question. Except
your question will be answered.
Maybe to reflect about how that risk is actually general risk, because no one is certain today that we'll have a job, that we'll have an income, etc. So this with that is really horrible. I mean, at least we should fight that they cannot use the flats, immobilities. That's what Slovenians, I think, have done. Yeah, that is the first step. And I think that you could mobilize people for that because we are owners in so great extent.
Ownership is creating passivity.
Yes. But if you are afraid to lose it, you lose it because you cannot pay, then it should be something.
I mean, it's not the guarantee. The
of course, it's not.
Especially here, because in the other European countries as well, because you got like a huge percentage of very poor owners who are now unable,
who might be in a risky situation,
and are in debt and are facing evictions.
And in case of GDR, there was no buying out of the flats. So the people who lived in some areas for 40 years, they needed to be displaced. And this is like, it became normalcy, like it's now normalcy not to have. Everything can be moved, maybe property not, but we are actually forced to move and be mobile.
Okay, now, unfortunately, I will have to evict all because we are all